The morning of February the 13th, 1899, Silas Dawson pulled his gray mule up the frozen hollow with the particular slowness of a man who expects to find something unpleasant at the end of his climb. He had buried 2 sons to Ozark winters. He knew what cold did to a body left without proper shelter. He knew
This
the
document
color of
changes
skin that
everything.
had
You
given
cannot
up.
deny it.
Where did you get
He had
this?
seen
The
it
truth
enough
always
times
surfaces.
that he no longer needed to touch a person to know whether they were gone. You could tell from the doorway. You could tell from the stillness. He had told the woman 10 weeks ago that she would not survive. He had told her plainly, without cruelty, the way a man tells another man that a bridge will not hold the weight he is planning to put on it. He had looked at her land. He had looked at her tools. He had looked at her situation. And he had done the arithmetic that she apparently refused to do. The numbers did not lie. They never did. The hollow was buried under 4 feet of drift. The cedars along the ridge were bent double with ice. The sky above them was the pale, washed-out blue that only appears after a cold so severe it seems to have bleached the color from the air itself. His mule's hooves broke through the crust with every step, and the sound was the only sound in the world. Silas Dawson was not a man who prayed often. But somewhere on that climb, somewhere between the tree line and the limestone bluff above it, he found himself doing something close to it. Not for the woman's sake exactly, for his own. Because he had told her she would die. And he had been so certain of it. And certainty was something Silas Dawson had built his entire life upon. His judgments, his assessments, his reading of land and weather and human capability. If he was wrong about this, he did not know what else he might be wrong about. He came around the last bend in the trail, and he stopped. There was smoke. Not the thick, rolling smoke of a fire burning wrong in an enclosed space. Not the desperate, choking column of a woman burning everything she had left to stay warm through 1 more hour. It was thin. It was clean. It rose from a crack in the limestone bluff in a steady, gentle thread, pulled upward by something he could not see, and it disappeared into the pale blue sky as if it had always belonged there. Silas Dawson sat on his mule in the frozen hollow and looked at that smoke for a long time. Then Lenora Callahan stepped out of the crack in the rock. She was standing in the entrance of something he did not have a word for yet. A rough-coated dog stood at her feet, one eye milky white, the other sharp and watching. She was alive. She was not stiff. She was not blue. She was standing in the entrance of the stone throat she had carved out of a hillside that he had told her was worthless. And she was watching him the way a woman watches a man who owes her an explanation. Silas opened his mouth, closed it. He was not a man who found himself without words often. He had come up the hollow to find a body. Instead, he found a door. This is the story of how that door was built. But to understand it, you have to go back 10 weeks. You have to go back to the beginning of December, 1898, to a frozen road at dusk, and a woman who had just had everything taken from her, except the one thing that mattered most. Lenora Callahan had never spent a single night alone in winter. That is the first thing to understand about her. Not that she was weak. Not that she was unprepared in some fundamental way that made what happened to her somehow her own fault. She was 32 years old, capable, clear-eyed. She had spent her entire adult life learning how to manage a household, how to preserve food, how to tend animals, how to read weather, how to stretch $1 until it bled. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but she had never been alone. Not in winter. Not in the way she was about to be alone. Her husband had not struck her. That is the second thing to understand, because it matters in ways that are not immediately obvious. In that time and place, a woman whose husband had struck her at least had a story. She had bruises. She had witnesses. She had something the law and the community could look at and recognize as real. She had something she could point to and say, "This is what was done to me. This is the evidence of my suffering." Lenora had none of that. What her husband had done was this. On the evening of December 4th, 1898, he had carried her trunk out of the house and set it in the yard. He had taken her coat from the hook by the door and laid it across the top of the trunk. He had gone back inside. He had turned the lock. And then he had gone to the kitchen and finished his supper. There was no shouting. There was no explanation. There was no moment of rage that might have at least carried some heat with it, some human energy that could be grabbed onto and understood. There was only the soft click of the lock, the yellow light in the kitchen window, and the cold. The road was already freezing into ruts by dusk. The nearest town was 8 miles east. Her nearest kin lived 12 miles through timber she could not cross at night, not in the dark, not without a lantern, not in the dropping temperature with the sky the color it was. She had $19 in the pocket of her coat, an iron pot wrapped in her second quilt, a hand axe with a loose eye, and a dog that had slipped under the wagon tongue 3 years ago and followed her home and never left. Shep was not a beautiful dog. He was large and rough-coated, with one eye gone milky from an old fight, and the other so sharp it seemed to compensate for everything the first one had lost. He was not affectionate in any demonstrative way. He did not wag and lean. He watched. He stood between Lenora and things he did not trust, and he had a bark that came from somewhere deep enough to mean it. He pressed against her leg on that frozen road, and that was enough. Lenora did not go to town. She did not go to her kin. She turned and walked toward the 20 acres her father had filed on and left her in a will so plain it took the lawyer 3 minutes to read aloud. 20 acres of rocky sloped ground at the head of a hollow above Griggs Creek in the Ozark Hill country of Newton County, Arkansas. Land nobody else had wanted, which was why her father had been able to file on it in the first place. Land that was all ledge rock and crooked cedar and steep ground, and a creek that vanished underground somewhere in the limestone before it reached the valley below. It was the only piece of paper in the world with her name on it that no man had signed for her. She could go back to her husband. She could surrender the land through abandonment. Let the courts fold it into debt arrangements that would benefit men who had been waiting for exactly this outcome. She could accept whatever version of a life was left to her. Or she could walk toward those 20 acres in the dark and figure out what came next. She walked. The cold that first night was not the worst she would face, but it was cold enough to teach her what she was up against. She found the lean-to her father had built years ago, One wall was already rotting through at the base. The roof sagged in the middle where snow had accumulated and never been cleared. She cleared a space on the frozen ground. She wrapped herself in both quilts. She pulled Shep against her chest for warmth. And she lay there in the dark, listening to the wind find every gap in those half-rotted walls. And she understood something that she had not fully understood before. This was not a problem that could be solved by working harder. This was not a situation where determination alone would carry her through. The land was what it was. The winter was what it was. The tools she had were what they were. And the arithmetic did not add up. She knew it. She knew it the way you know something in your bones before your mind has finished calculating it. But she also knew something else. She knew that going back meant becoming something she could not become and still remain herself. So she stayed. Garrett Callahan arrived on the third day. He was 39 years old. Her husband's cousin. A man of medium height and a smile that seemed to know things before they happened. The kind of smile that is really just confidence wearing a pleasant face. He had inherited money from a father who had been considerably better at making it than he was. And he had spent 15 years using that money to acquire things at the edges of other people's misfortune. Lenora's 20 acres were not valuable in any obvious way. The ground was too rocky for good farming. The timber was too crooked for milling. There was no flat bottomland, no reliable water source above ground, no natural meadow for grazing. But it sat at the head of a hollow that controlled drainage into a section of creek bottom that Garrett had been trying to consolidate for 3 years. If Lenora abandoned the parcel, the land would revert through a tangle of debt and filing arrangements that Garrett's lawyer had already mapped out. He would have it before spring. He needed her to fail. He did not need to do anything dramatic to make that happen. The winter would do it for him. He simply needed to be patient and to make sure that nobody helped her enough to change the arithmetic. He rode up the hollow on a chestnut mare that was too fine a horse for the trail. And he rode it anyway because it pleased him to have things that were too fine for their circumstances. He walked her land the way a man walks through a property he already considers his. He looked at the rocky ground, the crooked cedar, the lean-to with one wall rotting through. He looked at Lenora. The smile was there from the beginning. He offered her work, cooking, cleaning, whatever a woman could do in the valley below. He said it the way men say things they know will be refused so they can point to the refusal later and say they tried. He said her father would have wanted her comfortable. He said the land was worthless. He said it with the smile that knew things. Lenora looked at him the way she had begun to look at all the arithmetic that refused to add up, not with anger, with the kind of attention you give to a problem you are not finished with yet. She told him to stop circling. The smile went thin. He rode away. He would be back. She knew that. Men like Garrett did not stop because they were told to stop. They stopped because the thing they were waiting for either happened or it demonstrably could not happen. She had given him no evidence yet that she could survive. She had given him no reason to believe the thing he was waiting for would not arrive on schedule. She had 3 weeks of ordinary cold left. At best. After that, deep winter would settle into the hollow like something that had decided to stay. Silas Dawson came before anyone else. He was 58 years old, with a back that had been bent by decades of timber work before it finally refused any more of that particular punishment. His hands looked like they had been carved from the same material as the ridgelines he had spent his life on. He had come to the Ozarks as a young man, and he had not left. He had survived 11 winters on these ridges, which was not the same as living through them. Surviving a thing and living through a thing are different in ways that only become clear when you have done both. He had buried 2 sons to Ozark cold, one to exposure in a storm he should have seen coming, one to a fever that came after a night spent in a shelter that had failed. Silas Dawson had built that second shelter himself, had built it wrong in ways he had not known about at the time, and had spent the years since knowing exactly how wrong he had been. He did not introduce himself. He tied his mule to a cedar and walked Lenora's land the way a man walks a thing he has already assessed and is merely confirming. He found the half-rotted lean-to her father had built. He kicked the corner post. It wobbled. He looked at the sky. He looked at her. He said, "No south wall. The wind comes knife-hard through this notch. You have maybe a cord and a half of anything close enough to drag. You need 6 before January. 8 if the north wind parks on you." Lenora said nothing. He walked to the edge of the bluff where the limestone broke through the soil in gray shelves and scuffed the rock with his boot. He told her she could not build on it, could not dig in it, could not grow on it. She said, "I know what I cannot do." He looked at her. The way men look at sick animals they have already decided what to do about. And then he said the sentence that she would hear in her mind for the next 10 weeks. The sentence she would hold up against everything she was doing and ask herself whether it was still true. He said, "If you spend one night in rock instead of timber, they will carry you out stiff by dawn." He rode away. The sound of his mule's hooves on frozen ground faded into the cedars. Lenora stood alone on a bluff of limestone that held nothing but her name, and she listened to the silence after he was gone. The arithmetic was straightforward. A woman working alone could cut and drag perhaps a quarter cord of firewood per day if she did nothing else. She had roughly 10 weeks before the deep cold settled. A proper one-room cabin of any structural integrity would take 6 weeks of labor minimum for a single person with proper tools. She did not have proper tools. She had a hand axe with a loose eye that made the blade shudder slightly with every stroke. She tried the conventional way first. She marked 3 cedars she thought she could fell, within dragging distance of the lean-to. She swung the hand axe until her palm split. She wrapped her hands in cloth and swung it some more. She got 1 tree down in 2 days. The trunk was too crooked to notch properly. She could not lift it alone. Opal Pickett came up from the neighboring hollow on the 8th day. She was 36 years old, a widow of 3 years, who had learned what survival cost and had developed the particular directness that comes from paying that price repeatedly. She brought a jar of pickled vegetables and a question she did not dress up in any kind of social softening. She looked at the 1 crooked cedar Lenora had felled. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she counted on her fingers. 6 walls of timber to hold heat, a stone chimney or clay-lined fire pit, a roof that shed snow, chinking in every seam. She said, "You have 1 crooked tree and a dog." Lenora said, "I have $19. Opal said, $19 buys nails. It does not buy walls. Lenora said, then I will find something else. Opal handed her the jar of pickled vegetables and told her to eat before she starved to death. Deciding what something else meant, she did not laugh, but her face held the memory of wanting to. That night, Lenora ate alone in the lean-to and watched frost creep up the inside of the bucket. She could feel the deep cold coming, the way you can feel a change in the river when the weather upstream is already different from the weather where you are standing. It was moving toward her. It had been moving toward her since the moment she arrived. The question was not whether it was coming. The question was what she intended to be standing in when it arrived. The idea came from Shep. December 15th, 1898. A squall moved through the hollow in the early morning. Sleet coming sideways. The kind of cold that has teeth in it. Lenora had pulled both quilts over her shoulders and retreated as far into the lean-to as the lean-to allowed, which was not far enough. The wind found every gap in the half-rotted walls as if it had memorized their locations. Shep, who hated getting wet with a consistency that Lenora found almost admirable, bolted. He ran up the slope toward the limestone bluff above the hollow. And when Lenora looked up from her quilts, she could see him at the base of the rock face, nosing along the stone, whining, scrabbling at something she could not make out through the sleet. He pawed at what looked like a seam in the rock, a crack no wider than a hand's width, and he was doing it with the focused urgency he usually reserved for things that mattered. She told him to come back. He ignored her. She cursed and went after him. When she reached the bluff, she grabbed him by the scruff and pulled him away from the rock face. She was angry. She was cold and wet and angry, and she had enough genuine problems without her dog creating new ones. She started to turn back toward the lean-to. Then she noticed the grass at the base of the crack. In the thin strip of dead growth that clung to the rock face. The stalks were moving, not away from her. The way grass moves when the wind pushes through. Toward the rock, into the crack, as if something on the other side was drawing the air in. Lenora released Shep. She knelt in the sleet and pressed her bare hand against the crack in the limestone. Cold air pushed against her palm, but it was not the sharp, cutting cold of the wind that had been tearing across the hollow all morning. It was different. It was steady. It moved with a consistency that the wind outside never had. It was cool, the way a deep well is cool, with a stillness underneath the temperature, a quality that had nothing to do with the weather happening on the surface of the world. She had heard her father talk about this when she was small, before the farm, before everything. Her father had run trap lines along the bluff country near the White River. He was a man who noticed things that other men walked past, who would stop on a trail and spend 10 minutes examining something that looked like nothing, and then explain it in a way that made you understand why it mattered. He had told her once, crouched beside a limestone overhang with his hand near the rock face, still air keeps a body warmer than a fine coat. Find where the rock breathes out and you will find where the cold breathes slow. She had been 7 years old. She had not understood what he meant. She was 32 years old now, kneeling in sleet, in a hollow in Newton County, with her entire life balanced on 20 rocky acres. and she was beginning to understand. The crack was too narrow for a grown body, but cracks in limestone were not always what they appear to be at their surface. They led somewhere. They opened into things behind them. She had seen it in the bluff country her father had taken her through. Shelters behind shelves, chambers behind cracks, spaces that existed inside the rock that you would never know about unless you followed the stone far enough to find out what it was keeping. She let go of Shep. She put her face as close to the crack as she could get it and looked into the darkness. She could not see anything, but she could feel the air moving against her cheek, steady, deep. And she could smell something underneath the cold. Earth. Dry old earth. Not the damp soil smell of something wet and rotting, but the ancient settled smell of a place that had not seen water in a long time. Shep pressed against her leg and looked up at her with his one good eye. She said, "All right, let us see where you are trying to go." It took her 3 days. She used the hand axe as a pry bar, loose stones as hammers, her own body weight as the lever that the crack needed to become something larger. Her shoulders ached in ways she had no names for. Her hands cracked at the knuckles and bled through the cloth she wrapped them in and cracked again. She worked in the mornings when the light hit the bluff face and she could see what she was doing. And she stopped in the early afternoon when her hands stopped responding the way hands are supposed to respond. She told no one. Opal had not come back. Silas was wherever Silas went when he was not delivering verdicts. Garrett had not shown his face again, which was worse in some ways than if he had, because his absence meant he was patient. And patient men were harder to fight than impatient ones. On the third afternoon, as the light was beginning to go gold and thin along the ridge, Lenora turned sideways and pushed through. The chamber on the other side was not what she expected. She had expected a crack that opened into a slightly larger crack. She had expected rock pressing in from all sides. Low ceiling. The close and claustrophobic darkness of something that was barely a space at all. She had expected to squeeze in 3 feet and find solid stone waiting for her. Instead, she straightened up. The ceiling rose high enough that she could stand without stooping. Not a grand height, not the cathedral feeling of a large cave, but enough to stand, enough to move. The floor beneath her feet was packed earth mixed with dry sediment, firm enough that her boot left only a shallow impression. The walls were raw limestone, gray and close-grained, unmarked by smoke or soot, untouched by any fire she could find evidence of. She stood in the center of the chamber and let her eyes adjust. At the back of the space near the ceiling there was a fissure, narrow, jagged. The kind of opening that is the result of rock settling against itself over a span of time too long to comprehend. She pulled a scrap of cloth from her coat pocket and dipped it into the small tin of ash she had started carrying after the sleet. She held the cloth near the fissure and watched. The ash drifted toward the opening, steadily, without hesitation. It passed through and was gone. Lenora stood in the center of the chamber for a long time without moving. She was doing the calculations she had been doing since she arrived on this land. But the numbers were different now. She was subtracting things from the problem instead of adding to them. A cabin required walls she could not build. A cave had walls already standing. A cabin required a roof she could not raise. A cave had a roof already in place. A cabin required fuel to fight the cold that poured through every seam between the logs, through every gap in the chinking, through every place where two pieces of wood met at less than a perfect angle. A cave had no seams. The risks were real. She was not a fool, and she did not pretend otherwise. Fire in an enclosed rock space could fill it with smoke. A cave could flood in heavy rain. The ceiling could fail. She could suffocate. She could drown. She could be crushed by stone. She stood in the center of the chamber and named each risk. The way you name things you intend to deal with, not the way you name things you intend to use as reasons to stop. But if she tried to build a cabin, she would certainly freeze. The math was not complicated. Certain death against possible death. She knew how to bet that. The first night she slept in the chamber, she lay on her back on the packed earth, with Shep pressed against her side, and both quilts pulled over them, and she waited. She waited for the cold to find her the way it found her in the lean-to, seeping through the floor, driving through every gap, settling into her bones with the particular intimacy of cold that has nowhere else to go, and all night to arrive. She waited for the smoke to fill the space from the small fire she had built near the entrance, in the position she had guessed at before she understood anything about draft or thermal mass or the breath of limestone. The cold did not come the way she expected. It was still cold. She was not warm in any sense that she would have recognized from her life before this, but it was a different kind of cold. It was still. It did not move against her. The wind that she could hear screaming through the hollow outside, rattling the cedars, driving sleet against the rock face. That wind was not in the chamber with her. It was outside, on the other side of the stone. And the stone did not care about it. She lay in the stillness of 2 feet of solid limestone and listened to the wind fail to reach her. And for the first time since the evening she had stood on a frozen road with her trunk and her coat and $19, she thought, this might work. Shep put his chin on her chest and looked at her with his one good eye. She said, do not make that face at me. I know it is not warm. He wagged once and went back to watching the entrance. Outside, the wind drove through the hollow without finding them. Inside the stone throat, Lenora Callahan lay on packed earth and did the arithmetic again. And for the first time, the numbers bent in her direction. She had found the things she needed. Not timber, not tools, not money. She had found a place where the land itself was on her side, where the rock that everyone had told her was worthless was offering her the one thing she could not build and could not buy. Walls that had been standing for 10,000 years. A roof that no wind could lift. And somewhere above her in a fissure in the limestone, the steady breath of the stone, pulling the cold air out and away, keeping the chamber alive the way a slow and ancient lung keeps a body alive. One breath at a time. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would begin building in earnest. Tomorrow there was more stone to carry, more earth to move, more of the 1,000 small decisions that turn a crack in a rock into something a person can survive inside of. But tonight, for the first time in 3 weeks, she was not fighting the cold. She was inside it. She was surrounded by it. There were 2 feet of frozen air between her and the world outside this stone. and the stone was winning. When Opal Pickett came back 2 days later, she found Lenora carrying flat stones up the slope toward the crack in the bluff. She stopped and watched for a moment. Then she said, "What are you doing?" Lenora told her. Opal's face went through several expressions, none of which were encouraging. She looked at the entrance. She looked at Shep, who was sitting beside the opening with his tongue out, apparently satisfied with how things were developing. She looked at Lenora. She said, "You do not live in a hole." She listed the dangers with the precision of a woman who had survived enough to know them. Condensation, smoke, flooding, pressure shifts. She said, "Wait until January when the air changes and you will wake up with your lungs full of your own fire." Lenora said, "Then I will wake up dead somewhere instead of dead nowhere." Opal looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite belief, and not quite the opposite of it. She shook her head. She said that Lenora's father had been strange too, talking to rocks like they could hear him. Lenora said he talked to rocks because they listened better than people. Opal did not laugh, but something in her face changed. It softened by an amount small enough to miss if you were not paying attention, which Lenora was. Opal said, "If you insist on doing this, at least eat something first." She would bring onions. She left without saying she believed it would work. Lenora did not expect her to. She understood that there was a difference between belief and doubt on one hand and action on the other. Opal doubted. But Opal also kept feeding people while she doubted them. That was a form of something. It was enough. Garrett Callahan came back the following week. He came on the chestnut mare moving up the hollow with the unhurried ease of a man on his own property, and he stopped outside the widened entrance to the cave and looked at it with the expression of a man seeing something that confirms what he already suspected about the world. Lenora did not stop working. He said he had heard she was doing something unusual up at the bluff. He swung down from his mare and walked toward the entrance the way he walked all of her land, like a man checking on his investments. He looked at the widened opening, the flat stones she had been stacking to build the low shoulders that would narrow the entrance and block the wind. He looked at the drag marks in the frost where she had been hauling material up from the slope. He said, "This is your plan, living in a hole." She said, "It is a chamber. The rock is dry. The draft pulls." He laughed. It was the particular laugh of a man who has decided that something is ridiculous and wants to make sure you understand that he has decided it. He said, "You cannot keep house in a grave." He said, "Come down to the valley. I can find you work. Something a woman can do. Something reasonable." He said her father would have wanted her comfortable. Lenora set down the stone she was carrying. She looked at Garrett Callahan, and she thought about the 20 acres, the paper with her name on it, the lock clicking in the door, her husband's supper getting cold on the table, the particular calculated coldness of a man who does not need to raise his hand because he has other methods. She said, "Stop circling me like you mean to inherit me." The laugh died in his throat. Something colder replaced it. Something that was closer to the truth of who he was than the smile had ever been. He said, "When this fails, and it will fail, I will make sure they bury you properly." Your father would have wanted that." He rode back down the hollow. The smile he left with was thinner than the one he arrived with, sharper. Lenora watched him go. Then she turned back to the stone she had been carrying, picked it up, and kept working. She had come to understand something about Garrett Callahan in the weeks since he first rode up the hollow on his too fine horse. He was not wrong about the land. The land was difficult. The timber was crooked and insufficient. The rock was not suitable for conventional building. The ground was too steep and broken for proper farming. He was right about all of that. He had assessed it correctly. He was wrong about one thing. He had looked at the land and seen only what it lacked. He had not thought to ask what it had. By the end of the third week of December, Lenora had a beginning. Not a shelter. Not yet, but a beginning. The shape of something. The entrance was wider than the original crack, though still narrow enough that the wind could not drive straight through it. She had built up the stone shoulders on either side, flat slabs fitted without mortar, rising to shoulder height on both sides of the opening, so that anyone entering had to turn and angle through, and the wind had to make 2 turns to follow. Inside, she had cleared the floor of loose stone and leveled the packed earth near the curved wall at the back, where she had started sleeping instead of in the lean-to. She had built a rough hearth near the entrance, positioned where she thought it should go before she understood anything about how heat and air moved through enclosed stone. She was wrong about the position. She would learn that soon, but she did not know it yet. What she knew was this: the cold was coming. It was 3 weeks away, maybe less, and she was not ready. But she was closer to ready than she had been, and closer was the only direction that mattered. That night she sat by the fire in the chamber and watched the smoke rise toward the ceiling. Most of it found the fissure at the back and disappeared. Some of it did not. Some of it rolled back toward her, thin and gray, settling in the lower parts of the chamber before eventually finding its way out. She watched it. She noted it. She filed it away as something she did not yet understand, but would need to. Shep lay beside her with his head on his paws, watching the entrance, watching the fire, watching her. She said to him, "I do not know if this will work." He did not respond. She had not expected him to. She said, "But I know the other way does not work, so this is the way." She put another piece of cedar on the fire, watched the sparks rise, watched the smoke find its uncertain path toward the fissure, and she thought about her father, standing at the entrance of a limestone overhang 30 years ago, his hand against the rock, his voice explaining something she would not understand. For 25 more years. Find where the rock breathes out, and you will find where the cold breathes slow. She had found it. Now she had to learn how to live inside it. Old Ezra Cobb arrived without warning, the way men who have spent their lives underground learn to move. No hoofbeats on the frozen trail. No sound of boots on the rock approach. Lenora came out of the chamber at first light to gather the morning's kindling from the stack she had built against the bluff face. And he was simply there, sitting on a limestone shelf 10 feet from the entrance, his hands resting on his knees, watching her with the patience of a man who had been waiting long enough that waiting had stopped feeling like anything at all. He was 64 years old, though he looked older, in the way that men look older when the work they have done has been done inside the earth, rather than on top of it. His back was bent at an angle that suggested it had been arguing with him for years, and had finally won most of the argument. His hands were layered with calluses so thick they had lost the texture of skin and taken on something closer to the texture of bark. His coat had been patched so many times that the original fabric existed now only as a theory underneath the repairs. He was looking at the entrance to the chamber, the way a man looks at something he recognizes. Lenora picked up the hand axe from the kindling stack. She said, "Who is asking?" He said his name was Ezra Cobb. He said he had dug saltpeter caves during the war between the states and laid dry stone walls for 20 years after. He said he knew rock the way most men knew the faces of their children. He said he had been watching what she was doing for 3 days from the ridge above the hollow, and that he had come down this morning because she was doing it wrong and would die for it before January if nobody told her. He did not say it as a threat. He said it as a fact he was tired of carrying around by himself. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. She had received a great deal of advice in the past 3 weeks, almost all of it in the form of reasons why she could not do what she was doing. She had learned to distinguish between the advice that came from knowledge and the advice that came from the desire to see a conclusion confirmed. Silas Dawson had knowledge. Opal Pickett had experience. Garrett Callahan had only the conclusion he wanted to reach and the patience to wait for it. This old man sitting on her limestone shelf had something she had not encountered yet in 3 weeks of trying to survive on a rocky hillside in Newton County. He had not told her to stop. He had told her she was doing it wrong, which was an entirely different thing, and which assumed underneath everything that there was a right way to do it. She set the hand axe down on the kindling stack. She said, "Show me." He did not begin with explanations. That was the first thing she noticed about the way old Ezra taught. He did not stand back and lecture. He moved to the problem and put his hands on it. And the explanation came out of the contact between his knowledge and the specific thing in front of him. Never before. He walked into the chamber and stood in the center of it for a long time without speaking. He ran his hand along the limestone wall near the entrance. He crouched and pressed his palm to the packed earth floor. He looked up at the fissure in the ceiling at the back of the chamber. Then he looked at the position of the hearth Lenora had built, a ring of stones near the back wall, directly below the fissure. He shook his head once. She said, "What is wrong with the hearth?" He said, "Everything." He stood and walked to where she had positioned the fire. He said, "Fire near the back means smoke has to crawl across the entire length of the chamber to find the exit. You want fire near the entrance, not at the back. Heat rises, catches the draft, pulls the smoke up and out before it has the chance to fill the space you are sleeping in." He pointed to the fissure at the back of the chamber. He said, "Fire at the back is fire that is fighting the draft instead of using it." Lenora looked at the hearth she had spent 2 days building. The stones fitted together without mortar. The flat base. The careful arrangement she had been proud of 3 days ago. She said, "I will have to move it." He said, "Yes. In weather like this, while the ground is still workable, waiting makes it worse." That was the first lesson. She moved the hearth. She did it in a single day. working from first light until her hands refused any more of it, prying the fitted stones apart and carrying them one at a time to the new position near the entrance, rebuilding the base on ground that was harder than what she had worked with before and required twice the effort to level. Old Ezra watched. He corrected the angle of 2 stones and said nothing about the rest. The second lesson was about the draft. He cut a thread from the hem of his coat and tied it to a small stick. He had her hold the stick near the entrance while he built a test fire at the new hearth location. A small fire, barely more than a handful of kindling, just enough to produce smoke. They both watched the thread. For the first several minutes, the thread pulled steadily toward the fissure. Smoke rose from the fire, crossed the ceiling of the chamber in a thin line, and disappeared through the opening at the back. Lenora watched it and felt something she had not felt in weeks. Not relief exactly. Something more structural than relief. The feeling of a calculation that has been balancing on a single uncertain variable, suddenly resolving. Then the thread went still. Old Ezra said, "Kill it." His voice was sharp, urgent. Now. Not carefully. Not slowly. Now. Lenora smothered the fire with a flat stone, and the chamber filled briefly with a thin residue of extinguished flame before the air cleared. She looked at old Ezra. He said, "The pressure outside changes in the afternoon. When the pressure equalizes between the outside air and the air inside the fissure, the draft stops." He pointed to the thread, still hanging motionless from its stick. He said, "A fire burning when the draft stops is a fire filling this chamber with smoke. You cannot see it until it is already in your lungs." He looked at her. His eyes were the color of winter creek water, clear and cold and carrying the weight of everything they had seen. He said, "That is how people die in rock. Not from cold, from confidence." He made her practice. Fire and thread. Thread and fire. He made her learn the difference between a thread that was pulling steadily and a thread that was merely hanging in place with a slight tremor. That could be mistaken for movement by a person who wanted to see movement, because the cold was bad and the fire was warm, and stopping seemed like the wrong choice. He said, "The thread does not lie. You lie to yourself about what the thread is telling you. That is the thing to watch for." She practiced until she could read it in the first seconds, before her mind had the chance to tell her what it wanted to see. He stayed for 9 days. In those 9 days, Lenora learned more about stone and air and the behavior of fire in enclosed spaces than she had learned about anything in the previous 3 weeks combined. But she also began to understand something about the way old Ezra moved through the world, something that was separate from the technical knowledge he carried. He did not waste motion. He did not speak to fill silence. He ate what was offered and asked for nothing. He slept, rolled in his coat on the far side of the chamber, with the unself-consciousness of a man for whom sleeping in strange places had long since stopped requiring adjustment. He worked from first light until the light was gone, and he did not complain about the cold or the ground or the limitations of the tools available, which were severe. On the 4th evening, when they had moved on from the hearth and the draft to the question of fuel, Lenora asked him directly. They were sitting by the fire, the thread hanging steady above them, the smoke finding its path to the fissure with the reliability of a thing that has been taught where to go. She said, "Why are you here?" He kept splitting the piece of hickory he was working on, set the two halves aside, picked up another piece. He said, "I knew your father." The fire between them threw light against the limestone wall, and the shadows moved with it, and for a moment the chamber felt larger than it was, and also much smaller. She said, "You knew him." He said, "I knew a man who walked these hollows talking to rocks like they could hear him. If that was your father, then yes. I knew him well enough to miss him when he stopped walking." She waited. She had learned in 4 days that old Ezra said things in the order he intended to say them, and that pressing him for the next part, before he was ready, produced nothing except a longer silence. He set the split hickory aside. He said, "There was a cave collapse at a saltpeter mine near the White River in the winter of 1871. I was working the far chamber when the ceiling started talking." He looked at the fire. He said, "Stone talks before it falls. If you know the language, small sounds, particular sounds, most men cannot hear them." He looked at her. He said, "Your father could." He said, "He came back for me when the other men were already running. He read the pattern in the failing stone and found the one path through that would hold long enough for both of us to get out." He said, "He did not know me. He had been hired on that week. He had no particular reason to come back for a man he had barely spoken to." Old Ezra looked at the fire for a while. The light moved across his face, and the shadows moved with it. He said, "Your father died on this land without anyone beside him. I heard it 3 years after it happened, from a man at a mill who mentioned it the way you mention things that happen to strangers." He said, "It has bothered me since." He said, "Coming down here to tell you what I know about rock is the closest I can get to paying a debt I cannot pay." Lenora looked at the fire. She thought about her father, about the man who had talked to rocks and run trap lines and showed her how to read what limestone was doing when it moved air through its cracks. She thought about him dying alone on this hillside that nobody wanted, on 20 acres of rocky ground, with a paper that carried her name, leaving her the only thing he had. She said he would have called it square. Old Ezra said, "I know. That is why I am saying it to you and not to him." He picked up another piece of hickory. After that, he taught her differently, not as a student who needed to be corrected, as a partner who needed to be equipped. The third lesson was about thermal mass, which old Ezra explained not with those words, but with his hands against the limestone wall, and a description of what stone did that air could not. He pressed his palm flat against the curved wall at the back of the chamber, the section that bowed slightly inward, the place Lenora had been sleeping since the first night, because it felt marginally different from the rest of the rock, without her being able to say why. He said, "You felt it before you understood it. That is the right order." He explained that stone absorbed heat slowly, far more slowly than air, but that it released the heat it absorbed at the same slow rate. Air heated quickly and cooled quickly. Stone heated over hours and cooled over hours. A fire that burned for 4 hours against this wall would heat the wall. The fire could then go out, and the wall would continue releasing that heat for hours afterward. long into the cold dark of the night, long past the point when a fire built in an open cabin with chinking that let the wind through would have gone cold. He showed her where to sleep and where not to sleep. The curved section of the back wall positioned correctly relative to the hearth received the heat the fire threw and held it. The flat sections of the side walls were cooler. The floor near the entrance was coldest. He showed her how to build a fire in the evening and let it burn down to coals before she slept, so the wall could absorb the heat of the coal stage, which burned longer and steadier than flame. He showed her how to lay the wood so the coals would last until the earliest hours of the morning, when the cold outside was at its most severe, when the stored heat of the wall would have the most work to do. He showed her how to arrange her sleeping pallet against the curved wall so that she was receiving heat from 3 sources simultaneously: the residual warmth of the coals in the hearth, the radiated heat of the wall behind her, and the accumulated warmth of the chamber itself, which changed temperature far more slowly than the air outside, because it was surrounded on all sides by 2 feet of solid stone. She lay against the curved wall that night, with Shep pressed against her legs, and the temperature outside dropping through the floor of what had seemed cold the week before. And the wall was warm against her back. Not warm the way a fire is warm. Warm the way a thing is warm that has been absorbing heat for hours and has decided to give it back. She did not fully sleep, but she rested in a way she had not rested since December began. Old Ezra left on the 9th day. He did not make an occasion of it. He rolled his coat in the morning and took his few things from the corner where he had kept them, and told her what he was leaving her with, which he listed as 3 things: the knowledge, the thread, and the understanding that the stone would tell her everything she needed to know if she stayed in the habit of asking. His lungs were bad. He said it plainly without seeking sympathy, the way he said everything. The cold air of the chamber was not good for them, and the cold air of the hollow was worse. And the walk down to where he wintered was something he needed to do before the next front came through. He shook her hand, the way he would have shaken a man's hand, with the full grip and the directness of it. He said, "Your father read the stone. You are reading it too. The difference is you are learning it under pressure." She said, "Is that worse?" He said, "Worse because you cannot afford mistakes. Better because you will not forget what you learn." He walked down the hollow without looking back. She watched him until the trail bent around the cedar stand, and he disappeared. Then she turned back to the chamber and looked at it the way you look at something that is now entirely your responsibility. The thread hung near the entrance, tied to its stick, waiting. She went to work. There were days after old Ezra left that Lenora did not speak to another person, not because she was avoiding anyone, because no one came. The hollow was quiet in the particular way that hollows get quiet in the deep part of winter, when the cold has persuaded everything with good sense to stay where it is and not move until conditions improve. She worked. She carried stone. She split wood. She tested the draft with the thread twice a day, morning and afternoon, and she recorded what she found in the small notebook she had carried in her coat pocket since December, filling it with observations she had no other place to put. The afternoon pressure shift was real and consistent. It arrived at approximately the same time each day. within an hour of midday, and it lasted between 40 minutes and 2 hours depending on conditions she was only beginning to understand. During that window, the draft slowed or stopped entirely. She learned to plan her fire use around it. Mornings for building heat into the wall. Evenings for sustaining it. Afternoons for cold work outside the chamber. Gathering wood. Carrying stone. Doing the things that did not require a fire. On the 18th day after old Ezra left, she built the first afternoon fire without thinking about the timing, because she was cold, and her hands were not working properly, and the thread looked like it was pulling when she was not paying close enough attention to the distinction between pulling and merely trembling. The smoke rolled back. She was at the far end of the chamber when it happened, adjusting the food storage she had been building into the floor near the back wall. A pit 3 feet deep, lined with flat stone and packed straw, designed to keep the temperature around the roots and vegetables she was storing at the same steady coolness the earth maintained below the frost line. She had her back to the hearth. The first sign was Shep. He stood up from where he had been sleeping against the wood stack and moved to the entrance without making a sound. Just stood there, facing out. Lenora looked at him, then looked toward the hearth, and the smoke was already knee-high across the floor of the chamber and rising. She moved without deciding to move. The fire was small enough that smothering it was a matter of seconds. Flat stone over the coals. The familiar sound and smell of extinguishment. And she was at the entrance before the smoke had reached chest height. But the entrance was 4 strides away, and she had taken 3 of them in a chamber filling with gray air. And the 4th stride was through the tattered hide hanging at the entrance, into the cold outside. She sat in the snow outside the entrance and coughed until there was nothing left to cough out. Shep sat beside her and did not look at her with judgment, which she appreciated. She stayed outside for 10 minutes. The air was 12 degrees below freezing, and she was in her shirt sleeves, and she did not go back in for a coat, because the cold was doing something useful. It was clarifying her thinking. She had nearly made the mistake old Ezra had warned her about. She had let comfort override observation. She had seen what she wanted to see in the thread, instead of what the thread was actually telling her. She had been cold and her hands had not been working, and she had made the decision before she had finished the process that the decision required. She sat in 12-degree air in her shirt sleeves until her thinking was clear again. Then she went back inside, waited for the smoke to clear, checked the thread, confirmed the pressure was shifting, waited another 30 minutes for it to stabilize, and lit the fire correctly. She wrote in her notebook that evening, "The stone does not adjust to you. You adjust to the stone. This is not a negotiation." Garrett Callahan came back in mid-January. He did not come alone this time. He brought a man named Fulton who was his lawyer and who wore a coat that had no business being on a trail in the Ozarks in January. They rode up the hollow together and stopped outside the entrance to the chamber with the particular confidence of men who have decided in advance how a conversation will end. Garrett looked at the entrance. He looked at the stone shoulders Lenora had built up on either side, rising now to well above her head, fitted and solid, with the hide hanging from a wooden bar she had lashed across the top. He looked at the drag marks in the snow from the wood hauling she had been doing all week. He looked at the smoke rising from the fissure above, thin and clean in the winter air. He said Fulton had some questions about the water rights on this parcel. Lenora was stacking wood near the entrance. She did not stop. She said, "Ask them." Fulton asked them. They were the questions of a man who had been sent to find ambiguity that could be turned into a legal instrument. And the questions themselves told Lenora everything she needed to know about what Garrett was planning: the spring that fed the creek, the underground drainage through the limestone, the nature of improvements made on land where water rights were contested. The questions were careful and patient, and they added up in the direction Garrett intended them to add up, toward a claim that might not hold in a proper court, but would cost Lenora money she did not have to fight. She listened to the questions without interrupting. When Fulton finished, she said, "The spring was on this parcel when my father filed the claim in 1887. The water rights are in the same deed as the land title. Both are registered in Newton County. I will be happy to show you the registration if you would like to ride to the county seat." Garrett smiled. He said he was sure there was no need for that. The smile was different from the smile she had seen before. It was thinner. It was working harder to be what it was pretending to be. She said, "Is there anything else?" He looked at the chamber entrance for a moment. He looked at the smoke rising from the fissure. He said, "You have made it farther than I expected." She said, "I know." He said, "Winter is not finished." She said, "I know that too." He rode down the hollow with Fulton, the chestnut mare picking her way through the snow with the delicacy of an animal that found the whole situation beneath her. Lenora watched them go. Then she turned back into the wood she was stacking and continued stacking it. She wrote in her notebook that night. Garrett came back. The questions were about water rights. He is changing tactics, which means the first tactic failed. Changing tactics is something a man does when he is still trying, not when he has stopped. Note this. The warm rain came at the end of January, 3 days of it, which was not unusual for the Ozark Hill Country, where January could turn mild for a stretch and produce the kind of rain that falls on frozen ground and has nowhere to go but downhill as fast as it can travel. Lenora had known it was possible. She had not known how fast it would happen when it did. The hollow filled with the sound of running water before the first day was half over. She could hear it above her on the bluff face, sheeting down the limestone in thin curtains, collecting in every crack and seam and running down through the rock toward the lowest point it could find. She stood at the entrance of the chamber and watched the ground outside turn from frozen crust to moving water in the space of 2 hours. The drainage she had built around the entrance, the shallow trench she had cut in the first week to direct surface water away from the opening, was overwhelmed by the second afternoon. She did not stop to consider. She picked up the hand axe and the flat bar she used for prying stone and went outside in the rain and began to dig. She worked for 6 hours in water that ran over her boots and soaked through her coat and found every gap in her clothing with the patience of water, which has no urgency and therefore outlasts everything. She cut a new trench deeper than the first, running it farther along the slope so that it intercepted the flow before it reached the entrance level. She built a stone lip at the critical point, 2 courses of fitted flat stones set in the mud, high enough to redirect the sheet flow away from the opening. It was full dark before she stopped. The rain was still coming. She could not see what she had done in the dark. She sat in the entrance of the chamber with water running off her in rivulets, and Shep pressed against her, sharing his warmth with his usual wordless practicality. And she waited for morning. The morning came gray and still wet, but diminishing. The entrance was dry, not perfectly dry, not museum dry, but dry in the sense that matters, which is dry enough that the stored wood along the inside walls had not been touched by water, and the food pit had not been breached, and the packed earth floor was damp only at the very lip of the entrance, where the water had found its closest approach before the stone lip had turned it aside. Lenora looked at what she had built in the dark. In 6 hours of freezing rain, she looked at the trench and the stone lip and the way the remaining water ran along the new path she had cut for it, obediently, in the direction she had decided it would go. She wrote in her notebook, "The stone does not care about luck. It only cares about what you build." Opal Pickett came back in the first week of February. She came with a canvas sack over one shoulder, and the expression of a woman who has been arguing with herself for some time and has arrived at a provisional conclusion she is not entirely comfortable with. She set the sack down inside the entrance and opened it without preamble. Inside, a cast-iron kettle lid that could be modified to serve as a damper plate at the fissure opening, controlling the rate of draw without closing it entirely. Onion sets wrapped in burlap, a length of heavy canvas that was better than the hide Lenora had been using at the entrance. Opal looked at the chamber with the attention of someone seeing it properly for the first time. She had glanced in once weeks ago and had been looking at it from the outside ever since, which was a different thing from standing inside it and looking around. She touched the curved back wall. She looked at the thread near the entrance, still hanging from its stick. She walked to the food pit and crouched and looked into it, at the turnips and carrots and apples that were still firm. That had not frozen. That had not rotted. That had been sitting in the cool, steady dark 3 feet below the floor of the chamber through 6 weeks of Ozark winter. She said, "My loft storage lost half my apples to rot by Christmas. The other half froze solid last week." Lenora said, "I know. I thought that might be true." Opal stood up. She looked at Lenora with the expression that had been moving across her face all winter in small increments, never arriving all at once, always just slightly farther along than it had been the time before. She said, "My husband's brother has a bluff shelter on his property. There is a crack at the back where air moves through. I want to know if it could work." Lenora said, "Bring me to see it. I will tell you." Opal looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. She helped Lenora install the kettle lid near the fissure, adjusting the fit until the drawer could be partially restricted without being blocked. She showed Lenora how to pack the onion sets in straw so they would not sprout prematurely. She asked questions about the food pit and the sleeping shelf and the way the wall radiated heat through the night. And her questions were not the questions of a skeptic. They were the questions of a woman building a mental model of something she intended to use. She did not say she believed it would work, but she stayed for 4 hours asking about something she had called impossible. By the first week of February, the chamber was complete in all the ways that mattered. The entrance was narrowed to a deliberate width, flanked by stone shoulders that rose above head height, with the canvas hanging from the lashed bar at the top. The hearth was settled and seasoned, its stones heat-stained from weeks of use. The firebed raised slightly from the floor to improve the draft below the flame. The wood stacks rose shoulder-high along both interior walls, sorted by type: cedar bark and small splits for kindling, oak and hickory for the long burn, punky reject pieces for quick starts only. The food pit held turnips, carrots, apples, salt pork, and 4 jars of preserves Lenora had carried in her trunk from her husband's house. The blanket divider she had hung between the working end of the chamber, near the hearth and the sleeping nook against the curved wall, created a smaller interior space. That held warmth the way a cupped hand holds water. Better than an open palm. Better than no hand at all. The thread hung near the entrance, pulling steady in the mornings and evenings, slowing in the afternoons in the way she now knew to expect, in the way she had built her daily schedule around. Shep slept against the wood stack on the left wall, which was where he had decided to sleep 2 weeks ago, and from which he had not deviated. Because Shep, once he decided a thing, did not undecided it. She had built something. She had built it out of a crack in a hillside, and a dead man's knowledge and a thread cut from an old coat, and 6 weeks of waking before dawn, and working until she could not see what she was working on. She had built it wrong at first and corrected it. She had built it in the rain and in the cold, and in the particular loneliness of a hollow where no one was coming to help her unless they decided to on their own, which some of them had, and some of them had not. She had built it alone in all the ways that mattered. The chamber was ready, and the cold that was coming. The cold that Silas Dawson had warned her about without knowing he was warning her, about the specific event that would prove him right, about everything except the conclusion he had drawn. That cold was still coming. It had always been coming. The only question was whether the thing she had built would hold when it arrived. She sat by the fire on the evening of February 11th, with the thread hanging still in the windless air inside the chamber, and Shep asleep against the wood stack, and the food pit covered and the wood stacked, and the entrance dressed against the wind. And she listened to the hollow outside. The birds had been gone for 2 days. The creek stones below the hollow were glazed with ice that did not soften at midday, the way creek ice softens when the cold is ordinary. The air had a smell to it that she had not smelled before, something metallic and absolute. A smell that was not quite a smell, but was more like the absence of every smell that was not cold. She checked the thread one more time. It pulled steady. She looked at the curved wall that had been absorbing the heat of the fire all evening, and would go on releasing it through the night, slow and certain, the way the stone did everything. She looked at the wood stacked and sorted and ready. She looked at the entrance dressed and sealed against whatever was building itself in the dark to the north. She did not know if it would be enough. She had done everything she knew how to do, and some things she had not known how to do until she had to do them. And now there was nothing left but the thing itself, which was coming regardless of whether she was ready. She put one more piece of oak on the fire, watched the flame take it, watched the thread pull the smoke toward the fissure and out through the top of the bluff into the iron-smelling air above the hollow. Then she lay down against the curved wall, and pulled the quilts over her and closed her eyes. Tomorrow was February 12th, 1899. The stone was ready. She was as ready as she was gonna be. The cold arrived the way old Ezra had said it would, not like a storm, not with the drama of wind and noise and visible fury. Not at first. It arrived the way a debt arrives, quietly at the door, with the patience of something that has been on its way for a long time and has never been in any particular hurry, because it has always known it would get there eventually. Lenora felt it before she saw it. She woke on the morning of February 12th to a quality of silence she had not encountered before. Not the ordinary silence of the hollow and deep winter, which had its own texture. The creak of frozen timber, the distant movement of ice on the creek stones below, the small sounds of the land contracting against the cold. This was different. This was the silence of a world that had stopped moving in preparation for something. She lay against the curved wall and listened to it. The fire had burned down to coals through the night, exactly as she had arranged it, and the wall behind her was giving back the heat it had absorbed through the evening. In the slow, steady way limestone gives back everything it takes in. Her breath did not fog the way it fogged in the lean-to on her first nights on the land. The air in the chamber was cold, but it was still, and stillness was most of the battle. She checked the thread before she rose from the pallet. It was pulling steady and certain, the way it pulled on the best mornings, with the kind of consistency that meant the pressure differential between the chamber and the outside air was working in her favor. She looked at it for a moment longer than she needed to, the way you look at a thing you have learned to trust, but have not yet finished the process of trusting completely. Then she went to the entrance and lifted the canvas and looked out at the hollow. The sky to the north was the color of a bruise that is not finished forming. The temperature began to drop in earnest by mid-morning, not the gradual settling of an ordinary cold day, where the mercury moves down its column in the measured way of something following a schedule. This was different, in a way that was almost physical, almost a pressure, as if the air itself was being compressed by something vast and indifferent moving in from the north. Lenora had been outside gathering the last armload of wood from the stack against the bluff face when she felt the change. A shift in the weight of the air against her face. A sudden sharpening of the cold from something you move through to something that moved against you. She carried the wood inside and dressed the entrance carefully. The canvas secured at the top. The stone shoulders on either side doing the work she had built them to do, breaking the path of the wind, forcing it to turn twice before it could reach the interior. She checked the thread, still pulling. She built the fire up from the coals, feeding it carefully, oak first for body, a piece of hickory laid across for the long burn. Watching the smoke rise from the hearth and cross the ceiling and find the fissure and disappear, clean and steady. The thread confirmed what she could see. The draft was working. By mid-afternoon, the first snow came, not the tentative early snow of December, the kind that arrives apologetically and melts against the ground before it can commit to anything. This came with intention. It came horizontally, driven by a wind that had stopped gusting and started simply pressing. A continuous force from the north that did not relent between gusts, because it was not gusting. It was blowing the way a river runs, constantly, from something with more behind it than anyone standing in its path could calculate. Lenora sat inside the entrance with the canvas pulled back just far enough to watch the hollow disappear. The cedars at the tree line went first, swallowed by white. Then the limestone shelf on the far side of the hollow where she had gathered kindling bark since December. Then the slope below the bluff, the path she had worn into the frozen ground over 6 weeks of hauling wood and stone, gone, under a covering that arrived and kept arriving. She let the canvas fall. Inside the chamber, Shep pressed against her legs and looked at the hanging canvas with the alertness of a dog who understands that something is happening on the other side of a door, even if he cannot see it. She put her hand on his back. He did not relax, but he leaned into the contact. She put another piece of oak on the fire. The thread pulled steady. She waited. The temperature fell 15 degrees in 2 hours, then 20 more. She could feel it at the entrance, the cold finding the gap at the top of the canvas where the draft pulled through, finding the small imperfections in the stone shoulders where 2 pieces of limestone did not fit together with absolute precision. The chamber held. The curved wall continued to radiate the heat it had been absorbing all day. The fire burned low and steady at the hearth. Not the roaring blaze of a fire fighting a losing battle against wind pouring through log walls, but the controlled, purposeful burn of a fire working with a draft that was doing half the work for it. She monitored the thread every 30 minutes. She had not planned to be this vigilant. She had planned to sleep in shifts, to trust the system she had built, to rest in the knowledge that the stone knew what it was doing, even when she was not watching. But the sound of the wind outside, which she could hear now as a continuous low roar against the bluff face above her, made rest a theoretical concept. She could hear the hollow being taken apart and put back together in a different configuration. She could hear the cedars at the tree line bending under loads of ice that accumulated faster than the branches could shed them. She could hear the cold trying to find a way in. It did not find one. The thread pulled. The wall was warm against her back when she leaned against it, checking the fire, adjusting the oak, reading the chamber the way old Ezra had taught her to read it, not with any single sense, but with all of them simultaneously. The smell of the air, the behavior of the flame, the movement of the thread, the temperature differential between the working end of the chamber near the hearth and the sleeping nook where the curved wall held its warmth. The temperature outside dropped to 15 below zero. Inside the chamber, Lenora's breath fogged only faintly. She thought about Silas Dawson on his gray mule, riding away down the frozen hollow 10 weeks ago, his assessment delivered and his mind already on the next thing. She thought about the sentence he had left behind, the one she had been carrying since December. If you spend one night in rock instead of timber, they will carry you out stiff by dawn. She thought, it is not dawn yet. The wind shifted near midnight. It came from a different quarter, swinging around the north shoulder of the ridge above the hollow, and hitting the bluff face from an angle it had not hit before. And the pressure change inside the chamber happened within minutes. Lenora was watching the thread when it happened. She had been watching it every few minutes for the past 2 hours. The vigilance that old Ezra had taught her, the understanding that the draft was not a mechanism she had built and could rely on the way she relied on a stone wall. It was a relationship between the air inside the chamber and the air outside it. And relationships changed when conditions changed. The thread went still. Then it moved wrong, not toward the fissure, down. The smoke from the fire, which had been rising in a clean line and crossing the ceiling and disappearing through the fissure with the reliability of a thing that has been working correctly for weeks, dipped. The line broke. The smoke rolled back toward the floor, thin and low, the ghost of it spreading across the packed earth in a way that was almost too subtle to see in the firelight. Lenora's heart stopped for the length of one breath. Then she moved. She lowered the fire in one motion, a flat stone over the oak piece that was producing most of the smoke, leaving only the smallest core of coals that would keep the chamber from losing the heat the wall had been absorbing all evening. She moved to the fissure end of the chamber and used the stick she kept near the entrance for this purpose, to open the makeshift damper plate Opal had helped her install, moving it a half-inch farther from the opening than its current position. She watched the smoke. She waited. The thread moved slowly at first, the way a thing moves when it is re-establishing a pattern that has been interrupted rather than beginning one from scratch. The smoke near the floor thinned and lifted. The line above the hearth reformed, ragged at first, then clean, then steady. Lenora stood in the chamber with the cold outside trying to tear the world apart, and watched the draft re-establish itself, watched the smoke find the fissure and disappear, watched the thread pull toward the opening with the steadiness that meant the system was working again. She sat down beside the hearth and rebuilt the fire carefully, feeding it from the cedar kindling rather than the oak, smaller and hotter, producing less smoke while generating more immediate heat, coaxing the draft back to full strength before she trusted it with the longer burn of hardwood. She watched the thread for 20 minutes without moving. She built the fire back to its working level, only when she was certain. She understood something she had not fully understood before. The thing that old Ezra had been trying to tell her when he said that confidence was the thing that killed people in rock. It was not the cold that was the greatest danger. It was the moment when everything had been working correctly for long enough that you stopped paying attention to whether it was still working correctly. The stone did not care about her confidence. The stone did not reward her weeks of effort with a guarantee. The stone offered a relationship, and the relationship required her full attention every time. Not only when she felt uncertain, but most urgently when she felt most sure. It was Shep who heard it first, somewhere near midnight. The dog lifted his head from where he had been lying against the wood stack and turned toward the entrance with his one good eye focused on the canvas, with the particular intensity that meant something was on the other side of it that he had not decided about yet. Not the bark he used for strangers, which was sharp and declarative. The other bark, the one he used when something was wrong in a way that required her immediate attention. Lenora was on her feet before the sound was fully out of him. She crossed the chamber to the entrance and pushed the canvas aside, and the cold hit her face like a flat stone, and the snow beyond the entrance was knee-deep and still coming, and there was something moving in it. A shape, low and struggling, coming toward the entrance from the direction of the trail down the hollow. She grabbed the hand axe from its place beside the entrance and stepped out into the snow and the wind and the cold that was so far below zero. She felt it against her face as a physical force rather than a temperature. And she saw what it was. He was maybe 12 years old. He was crawling on his hands and knees through snow that was deeper than he was capable of walking through. And he was not wearing a coat. He was wearing the shirt and trousers of a boy who had left somewhere in a hurry without preparation, without the things you need to survive 12 minutes in 23 below zero, let alone however long it had taken him to make it up the hollow from wherever he had started. His lips were the blue-gray color of lips that have stopped being warm. Lenora dropped the hand axe in the snow and went to him. She got her hands under his arms and pulled him upright, and his legs worked only partially, moving with the mechanical cooperation of limbs that have not yet received the message that they are in danger but are beginning to suspect it. She pulled him through the entrance and into the chamber, and let the canvas fall behind them. He was Emmett Pickett, Opal's boy. He managed to say that much before his teeth started going. The hard, uncontrolled chattering that happens when a body is trying to generate heat by any mechanical means available, because the heat it was depending on has largely departed. He said his mother had sent him. He said the stock had broken through the fence in the storm. He said old Silas Dawson was trying to get them back. He said his mother had told him to find Lenora. He said Mama said you would know what to do. Lenora was already moving. She pulled his boots off. His feet were white. Not blue. White. There is a difference, and the difference matters more than almost anything else in the treatment of a body that has been exposed to cold, severe enough to stop the blood from reaching its extremities. Blue means the blood is still moving, still fighting, still trying. White means the blood has retreated entirely, has pulled back from the battlefield of the outer body to defend the interior, the organs, the core. White means the tissue at the surface has been abandoned, and the question of whether it can be recovered depends entirely on what happens in the next hour. She did not heat water directly and pour it over his feet. She did not put his feet near the fire. She did not do the things that feel like helping, but that kill the tissue they are meant to save by introducing warmth too fast to a place that has lost the capacity to regulate it. She packed snow into the iron pot and set it near the fire, not on it, near it, so it would melt slowly into water that was cold but not frozen. She took 3 stones from the edge of the hearth where they had been sitting for hours absorbing the heat of the fire, and she wrapped them in the spare cloth she kept folded near the wood stack, and she pressed them against Emmett's sides, his chest, the insides of his thighs, where the large blood vessels ran close to the surface, not his feet, not yet. She rubbed his hands between her own. She wrapped both quilts around his shoulders. She spoke to him, not the reassuring murmur that adults offer children in crisis because they cannot think of anything useful to say, but direct and practical, telling him what she was doing and why, telling him to stay awake, telling him that his feet were going to hurt when the blood came back, and that the pain was going to feel like the worst thing he had ever experienced, and that it meant he was going to keep his toes. Shep pressed himself against Emmett's legs through the quilts, adding his animal warmth to the inventory of warmth available, which was what Shep did when he understood that warmth was what was needed. The fire burned steady, the thread pulled clean. The curved wall gave back its heat in the slow, reliable way limestone gives back everything it has taken in. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the absolute consistency of stone, which does not hurry and does not stop. The first wave of pain hit at midnight. Emmett's color had begun to return, the gray-blue fading back towards something that resembled the color of a living boy, the blood finding its way back to the places it had abandoned. His feet began to hurt around midnight, which was what she had promised him, and he woke and made the sounds a 12-year-old boy makes when he is trying not to make sounds. And Lenora sat beside him and told him what the pain meant. And he went back to sleep with the quilts pulled to his chin and Shep immovable against his legs. The second wave came near 3 in the morning. Something hit the entrance from the outside, not the wind. Something deliberate. A knock. Or the closest thing to a knock that a person can produce when their hands are wrapped in bloody rags, and they are shaking so severely that controlled motion is largely theoretical. Lenora picked up the hand axe. She crossed the chamber to the entrance. She lifted the canvas. Garrett Callahan stood in the snow outside the entrance to the chamber he had called a grave. His hands were wrapped in rags that had been cloth, and were now mostly dark, with what she recognized immediately as blood from burns. His face was the color of ash that has been cold for a long time. He was shaking with the full-body violence of a man whose core temperature has dropped past the point where the body can manage the shaking strategically, and is simply shaking because it cannot stop. His stovepipe had torn loose in the wind. The draft in his chimney had failed. He had burned his hands in the dark, trying to reattach it, trying to restore the fire he needed to survive the night. And he had not been able to. The fire had gone out. The cabin had begun to lose heat at the rate that a timber cabin loses heat when the wind is coming through the gaps at 23 below zero. Which is to say quickly, which is to say at the rate of a death that arrives in stages. He had ridden 3 miles through that wind and that temperature on his fine chestnut mare to reach the place he had spent 10 weeks trying to ensure Lenora would abandon. He stood in front of her with his burned hands and his ash-gray face and his uncontrolled shaking. And he did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said. There was no version of explanation or apology or self-justification that was adequate to the specific fact of a man standing in front of a woman he had tried to ruin at the door of the thing he had called a grave, because it was the only warm place left in 3 miles of 23 below zero. Lenora looked at him. She looked at the burned hands and the gray face and the shaking that he could not control. She thought about the drying rack he had kicked apart with the casual ease of a man who does not expect consequences. She thought about Fulton and his careful questions about water rights. She thought about the thin, sharp smile and the words, "When this fails, I will make sure they bury you properly." She thought about all of it. Then she stepped aside. She said, "Get in." No conditions. No explanation. No inventory of the things he had done and the accounting she was choosing to suspend. Just the 2 words that were the only words the situation required, spoken with the same plainness with which she had been doing everything for 10 weeks. With the directness of a woman who had learned that plain things done correctly were worth more than complex things done with feeling. Garrett came through the entrance and into the chamber. He did not look at Emmett sleeping against the curved wall. He did not look at Shep, who had risen from beside the boy and was watching Garrett with his one good eye from a position that was not threatening, but was also not welcoming. He did not look at the wood stacks or the food pit or the blanket divider or any of the evidence of the thing Lenora had built inside the rock he had told her was worthless. He sat down against the wood stack on the far wall and looked at the floor. Lenora dressed his hands with the clean cloth she kept folded near the food pit. She worked without commentary. The burns were serious, but they were not the worst she had seen. Not deep enough to take the hands. Not if they were kept clean and warm. She worked by firelight and by the light of the chamber itself, which seemed to hold more light than its single source should have been able to provide, the way a stone space amplifies certain things. Garrett said nothing while she worked on his hands. When she finished, he looked at the wrapped cloth for a moment. Then he looked at the fire. His shaking had begun to diminish, the warmth of the chamber reaching him the way warmth reaches a very cold person, in stages. The outer cold reluctantly giving way to the heat that is being offered. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He sat against the wood stack and stared at the stone floor and said nothing. And Lenora returned to her place by the hearth and watched the thread in the fire and the sleeping boy and the gray light that was beginning to find its way through the gap at the top of the canvas, announcing that the night had a limit after all. Dawn was coming. Old Ezra arrived with the first full light. He came up the hollow the way he always came, without announcement, appearing at the entrance with the frost thick in his beard and 2 hens tucked under his coat against the cold. One of the hens was dead, frozen solid sometime during the walk up the trail, stiff as carved wood. The other was alive and indignant about the entire situation, which old Ezra seemed to consider a reasonable position. He stepped into the chamber and stood in the center of it and looked at what was there. Lenora by the hearth, the thread pulling steady above her, the fire burning at its controlled working level, the wall behind her warm with stored heat. Emmett Pickett sleeping against the curved back wall with both quilts and Shep against his legs. His color fully returned. His breathing the slow and even rhythm of a boy who has passed through danger and come out the other side of it into genuine sleep. Garrett Callahan against the far wood stack with his burned hands wrapped in clean cloth, staring at the floor, alive. Old Ezra looked at all of it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Now you know it." Lenora shook her head. She said, "The stone knows it. I just learned to listen." Old Ezra looked at the thread. He looked at the fire. He looked at the wall. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man who has been right about something for a long time and does not feel the need to say so. He set the dead hen down near the entrance and held the living one against his chest. Silas Dawson arrived an hour later. He came up the hollow on his gray mule through snow that was still 4 feet deep in the drifts and knee-deep everywhere else, and he tied the mule to the same cedar he always used and walked to the entrance of the chamber and stepped inside. He stood in the entrance for a long time. He looked at the thread. He pressed his hand against the wall near the hearth and felt the warmth. The stone was releasing the steady, unhurried warmth of limestone that has been absorbing heat for 14 hours and has a great deal of it left to give. He looked at the wood stacks. He looked at Emmett Pickett sleeping safely. He looked at Garrett Callahan, who had ridden 3 miles through 23 below to knock on the door of a grave. He stood there long enough that the silence between them became something with a shape to it. Then he turned to Lenora. He said, "I told you they would carry you out stiff by dawn." His voice was the rough, undecorated voice of a man who spent most of his words on practical matters. He said, "Instead, I walked in here under my own breath to ask how you held this." Lenora said, "The stone holds heat longer than air. The walls have no seams for the wind to find. The roof does not lift. The draft pulls the smoke out so it does not fill the space." She gestured to the food pit. "The ground stays cool enough below to keep food through the worst of it." Silas looked at the food pit. He looked at the blanket divider. He looked at the entrance design that had kept the wind outside while allowing the draft to do its work. He said, "How much wood did you burn last night?" She said, "Less than a quarter cord." He looked at her for a long moment. "A night like the one that had just passed," he said, "would have burned through a full cord in a properly chinked timber cabin." He had burned through nearly 2 himself, and his cabin had still been cold enough to see his breath by morning. He said, "Show me how the draft works." And Lenora showed him. The trial was held in June, in the county seat, in a room that smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the particular combination of those smells that means the law has been sitting in the same place for a long time. Garrett had filed his claim in May. He argued the water rights on Lenora's parcel had been misregistered, that the underground spring actually originated on land he controlled, that her improvements to the bluff chamber constituted development of property she had no right to develop. The claim was constructed with Fulton's careful legal architecture, designed not necessarily to win, but to cost, to tie the parcel in dispute long enough that Lenora's position became untenable. Everyone in Newton County who heard about the filing understood what it was. The knowledge did not stop it from being filed. Lenora brought her deed. She brought Silas Dawson, who testified that the spring had been associated with that parcel since before anyone present could remember. In the plain, declarative way that Silas stated everything, as fact, rather than opinion. She brought Opal Pickett, who testified to what she had seen, a dry chamber in a bluff face with no connection to any spring or water source. Improvements made to a space that belonged unambiguously to the parcel described in the deed Lenora held. Garrett sat across the room with his scarred hands folded on the table. The burns had healed into pink ridges that would fade to white over the years, but would never disappear entirely. He did not look at Lenora throughout the proceeding. The magistrate dismissed the claim in 12 minutes. Outside the courthouse in the June sun that had turned the mud of spring into the hard-packed clay of early summer, Garrett stood on the steps and watched Lenora walk away. He did not follow her. He did not call after her. He stood there in the sun with his scarred hands and watched the woman he had spent a winter trying to destroy walk away from the last instrument he had tried to use against her. Lenora did not look back. She had learned in the months since February that looking back was something you did when you were unsure of the direction you were moving in. She was not unsure. Garrett sent a ham to the wedding. No note, no explanation. The ham arrived the morning of the ceremony wrapped in cloth. left at the bottom of the trail with no indication of who had left it or when. Nobody at the gathering knew what to say about it. Lenora accepted it without comment and served it at the table alongside everything else. And it was eaten without ceremony, the way most things worth eating are eaten. Some things do not need to be explained. They simply are what they are, which in this case was a ham from a man who had spent a winter trying to ensure that the woman who received it would not survive to receive anything, arriving at her wedding without apology or acknowledgement, which was the closest Garrett Callahan was ever going to get to either. Harlan Boone arrived in August. He was 43 years old, a teamster and blacksmith who had lost his smithy to a fire the winter before and had come to Newton County because he had heard there was work, and had found the work because Lenora needed stone hauled, and he had a wagon and 2 mules that could haul it. He was a large, quiet man, with the hands of someone who had spent 20 years working with iron, and the patience of someone who had spent 20 years working with mules. And he showed up on the first morning and moved 1,800 pounds of limestone from a quarry face 3 miles away, without complaint or commentary. On the second morning, he came back without being asked. He said he wanted to see how the stone would be used. Lenora showed him the chamber. She showed him the improvements she and old Ezra had built together, and the ones she had built alone afterward. The double canvas, the stone bench, the better-lined food pit. She showed him the plan she had drawn for the next phase of work. Harlan looked at everything. He asked questions about weight distribution in the stone bench supports, about the load-bearing capacity of the limestone in the area where she wanted to extend the entrance shoulders. The questions were specific, and they came from knowledge, not curiosity, which was a different thing. Then he asked if he could help. What Lenora noticed first was not the competence, though the competence was real and immediately apparent. What she noticed was that he asked before he changed anything. He said, "I think this support would hold better angled north instead of south. But it is your chamber. You decide." He said, "The sled runners would last longer with iron shoes. But that is an expense, and you would have to decide if it is worth it." He said, "I could stay for supper if you wanted company, but I can also leave. Either is fine." He meant it. She could hear in the way he said it that either actually was fine, that his offer was not the kind of offer that comes with an expectation built into it, not the kind that has to be turned down carefully to avoid consequences. She had not known that men could offer things that way. By September, he was staying for supper most evenings. By October, he had built a small shelter near the entrance where he slept when the work ran late, which was most evenings. By November, she had stopped thinking of the work as hers and his, and started thinking of it as work. In December of 1899, 1 year after the night, she had stood on a frozen road with a trunk and a coat and $19 and a dog who had decided to follow her. Lenora Callahan married Harlan Boone. The ceremony was small. Opal was there. Silas Dawson was there, standing at the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has revised his understanding of a thing and is still in the process of deciding how he feels about the revision. A dozen people from the valley were there, people who had learned something from the chamber in the bluff, who had modified their food storage or their approach to storm sheltering based on what Lenora had figured out in a hollow in Newton County, with a hand axe and a dog and a dead man's knowledge. Old Ezra died on the morning of March 19th, 1899. 3 weeks after the storm, Lenora found him sitting against the wood stack on the left wall, in the position he preferred when he was resting, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes closed, and his face holding the expression of a man who was finished with a long piece of work and had set it down. The cough that had been worsening through February and into March had stopped. His breath had stopped with it. She sat with him for an hour before she told anyone. She held his hand, which was still warm from the fire he had built before dawn, and she looked at the chamber they had improved together over the weeks since the storm. The double canvas hanging at the entrance, the stone bench flanking the hearth, the better-lined food pit with the ash and straw separation between layers of vegetables. She could not find words for what she was feeling, so she did not try to find them. She simply sat with him in the chamber where they had both survived the thing that should have killed one of them, and instead had killed neither. And she let the time pass at the pace that grief requires. She buried him on the slope above the hollow, in the place where he could see the bluff and the entrance to the chamber, and the valley below. She marked the grave with flat limestone slabs fitted together without mortar, the way he had taught her to work with stone, pieces chosen for how they fit together, rather than cut to fit a plan. She set the stones herself over 2 days, working in the cold March air until her hands went numb and she had to warm them at the hearth before she could work again. His coat hung on the peg near the entrance for 3 more scies. Then she folded it and put it away. His tools stayed in the corner where he had left them, wrapped in oilcloth, ready for work. She did not move them. She did not see any reason to move them. The community came to the chamber in the weeks after the storm, the way water comes to low ground, by finding the path of least resistance and following it until arrival. They came with the particular expression that people wear when they have been wrong about something publicly and are trying to decide what to do about that. Not shame exactly. Something more pragmatic than shame. The expression of people recalculating. Silas Dawson came back 3 times in February and March and asked questions about the draft, about the thermal mass of the wall, about the food pit, and how deep was deep enough, and what lining worked best in different soil types. He asked them the way he asked everything, directly and without apology, as if the questions were simply the logical consequence of information he needed, and she had. He did not say he had been wrong, but he asked the questions of a man who knows he was wrong and is doing the work of being right instead. Opal Pickett brought Lenora to the bluff shelter on her brother-in-law's property 2 weeks after the storm. Lenora walked the shelter the way old Ezra had walked her chamber on that first morning, pressing her hands against the stone, reading the draft with a thread, looking at the watermarks on the wall that told the history of where water had been and would come again. She told Opal which sections of the wall were dry and which were not. She told her where to build the hearth and where to build the food storage, and how deep to go into the earth to reach the temperature that held through winter. By the end of February, Opal had a working food storage chamber. Her apples lasted through March. Her carrots were still firm in April. The years that followed were years of building. Not only the building of stone and wood and the practical infrastructure of a life on difficult land, though there was plenty of that. Harlan extended the chamber entrance and improved the drainage and built a proper workshop on the slope above the hollow where tools could be repaired and stored through the seasons. Lenora planted an orchard on the south-facing slope where the sun reached longest, and the apple trees grew on ground that Silas Dawson had assessed as worthless with the same authority with which he had assessed everything. And the apples from those trees were crisp and sweet in a way that became known in the valley long before anyone made the connection to the hillside they came from. Lenora bore 2 children in the chamber, where she had survived the storm that was supposed to kill her. A daughter first, then a son. They grew up in the hollow knowing the stone the way children who grow up on farmland know soil, as something alive, something that communicated if you learned the language of it. They grew up hearing their mother talk about the draft and the thermal mass and the distinction between a dry chamber and an active drainage opening. The way other children heard their parents talk about crop rotation and fence repair. It was simply the knowledge of the place they came from. The method spread in the way that practical knowledge spreads. Person to person, problem to problem, one winter at a time. By 1917, families in Newton County were using some version of what Lenora had figured out in the winter of 1898. Dry chamber food storage, bluff entrance heating with draft management, the distinction between stone that holds and stone that floods, the thread test and the smoke test, and the watermarks that tell you where the past has been and will come again. Not everyone lived in rock full-time, but many used cave-adjacent storage and storm sheltering, and all of them knew the rule that Lenora had stated first on a cold February day to a man who had nearly drowned his family in the shelter he had chosen wrong. Live where stone and air and water agree. Silas Dawson died in 1903. His last words to Lenora, spoken on the slope above the hollow on a November afternoon when the light was going gold and thin along the ridge, were the same words he had spoken the morning after the storm. He said he had walked in under his own breath to ask how she had held it. He said he had never stopped asking. He said that in 5 years of asking he had learned more about stone and draft and the way cold moves through the world than in the 50 years before the asking started. Opal Pickett lived until 1912. The bluff storage chamber on her brother-in-law's property outlived her and was still being used by her grandchildren in the 1920s. The apples still firm in January, the carrots still crisp in March, the cold still doing the work that Opal had once called impossible. Harlan Boone died in 1914, his heart stopping without warning on a morning in September when the work was ordinary and the day gave no indication of what it intended. Lenora buried him on the slope above the hollow near Old Ezra where the view reached from the bluff face across the valley to the ridgeline beyond. She lived alone in the chamber for 7 more years. She worked. She tended the orchard. She answered the questions of people who came up the hollow to ask about the draft, or the food pit, or the watermarks on stone. She wrote in her notebook, which was by now not the small book she had carried in her coat pocket in the winter of 1898, but the 3rd notebook she had filled since then. The observations of 22 winters of learning to read what the stone was telling her. She died on the morning of March 4th, 1921. Her grandson found her on the sleeping shelf against the curved back wall, the position she had chosen on her first night in the chamber, when she had understood without being able to explain why, that this was the right place. The dog that slept at her feet was the great-granddaughter of Shep, rough-coated and loyal in the way that some dogs are loyal across generations. As if the commitment made by the first dog is understood by every dog that follows. The fire had burned down to coals. The thread near the entrance was pulling steady toward the fissure. The same pull it had made on every morning of 22 winters. The breath of the stone doing what the breath of the stone did, without drama, without urgency, because it had been doing it for longer than any of them had been alive to observe it, and would go on doing it long after the last of them was gone. The wall beside the sleeping shelf was warm. She was buried on the slope above the hollow beside old Ezra and Harlan Boone, where the view reached from the bluff face across the valley to the ridgeline that had watched over all of them through all the winters they had lived here. The marker was flat limestone slabs fitted together without mortar, chosen for how they fit rather than cut to a plan. The way she had been taught to work with stone by a man who had learned it underground. The inscription was simple, because she had been a plain woman who believed that plain things done correctly were worth more than complex things done with feeling. It read, "She learned to read the stone. The chamber stood. The valley that had called it a grave used it through another generation, and another after that. The warm room in stone the grandchildren called it, and the name outlasted the people who remembered where it came from, which is how the best names work. They separate from their origins and become simply true." By 1925, 4 years after Lenora's death, the method she had developed in a winter when everyone around her was waiting for her to fail had become common knowledge in the hill country of Newton County, passed from neighbor to neighbor, the way recipes pass, and the way remedies pass, adjusted and improved with each passing, the knowledge growing with the distance it traveled from its source. None of the people who used it in 1925 could have named, if asked, the winter it came from. None of them could have told you about the woman who had stood in a crack in a limestone bluff in December of 1898 with a hand axe and $19 and a dead man's knowledge, and had looked at what could not be done and decided to do something else instead. But they knew where to build the hearth. They knew how to read the thread. They knew the difference between a dry chamber and an active drainage opening. And they knew what the watermarks on the wall were telling them about where the past had been. They knew that the stone held heat longer than air. They knew that the walls had no seams for the wind to find. They knew to live where stone and air and water agree. And on the coldest nights of the coldest winters, when the temperature dropped past what the thermometer was designed to measure, and the wind pressed against the limestone bluff faces of Newton County, with the full weight of what it carried the chambers held, the draft pulled. The stone was warm. The valley had called it a grave. The cold taught them it was a door.